Hello, everyone, and welcome to Autocrat. And we are delighted in this bonus episode to be joined by Dominic Perry from the History of Egypt podcast. So, Dominic, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here, and let's talk about some Egyptian and Roman cross parallels.
Yes. So, first of all, in case there's anyone who doesn't know, Dominic runs the History of Egypt podcast. So, do you want to tell the audience a bit about that and where they can find you if they haven't already?
Sure. So, the History of Egypt podcast is available on all podcasting apps, Spotify, Apple, Castbox, whatever you use generally. The shortest pitch that I would give it is that it's a week by week chronological history of ancient Egypt from the beginning of the historical period around 3000 BCE, going all the way up to the death of Cleopatra VII, and then probably a little bit beyond with the Roman occupation of Egypt. I started the show in 2012. So at the time of recording, that was about 13 years ago. I've finally reached Ramesses II, who's quite a famous pharaoh, and that's around 1300 BCE, give or take. So a little bit earlier than what an Autocrat listener might be used to with the historical traditions of Italy and mainland Greece, where with Egypt, everything is exponentially older in terms of where the stories are taking place. But as I'm sure we'll see, there's a lot of follow-through, traditions, parallels, and influence from Egypt and the Near East that comes into the Greek and Roman traditions. And exploring that on the podcast has been a lot of fun. So you can find the History of Egypt podcast pretty much anywhere on podcasts. We also have recently started doing YouTube more, and there'll be links in the episode description, which I'm sure we can arrange.
Yep, absolutely. So, to sort of ground ourselves, as it were, before we move into the sweep of Egyptian history, I thought it might be interesting to have a brief discussion about Egyptian mythology and perhaps some of the parallels that our audience might find with Greek mythology.
Mm-hmm.
So, the first thing that I suppose we would notice from a religious parallel standpoint is that I believe in the very beginning with Egyptian mythology, you have non-being or nun, whereas the Greeks had chaos, and then you have one god who first comes before all others. Is that roughly right?
Yes, and depending on your phrasing, that may have been extremely appropriate. I will stress for listeners at the beginning that my knowledge of Roman and Greek mythology is probably would be considered academically out of date. I learned it growing up, and then at secondary school and university, I did Roman and Greek alongside Egyptian, but I certainly haven't kept up with it over the past 20 years because I've been so focused on Egypt. So any comments I make about that should be given that asterisk of, Roman and Greek mythology is not my professional specialty beyond what I've been picking up from endless replays of Hades, which is possibly one of my favorite games ever. And I was literally just playing a run of it about an hour ago before we started recording.
Yeah.
With that out of the way, the ancient Egyptian mythological tradition doesn't have a single unified structure or canon.
Right.
Because the ancient Egyptians their society began as a collection of disparate towns and communities strung out along the Nile Valley, which is a very long stretch of river. It's quite hard to understand until you really go there and look at it. It's a very long country. Every town, essentially, during the early prehistoric era, developed their own religious traditions with their own patron deity who was the most important in their little location. And as a result, many of them had distinctive explanations for where the universe came from. So the version you just described, which is the cosmic nothingness, which is called Nun, it's not so much nothing as it is a vast ocean of nothing, if that is even conceivable. Because the ancient Egyptians, fundamentally for them, water was life. They lived in the middle of a desert. Their entire society was structured around this river, which provided all the potable water they needed. It fed the crops, it fed the animals, it fed all kinds of things. They understood that intuitively, that water was the origin of life. So in one of the religious traditions, which is a relatively famous one, there was the infinite ocean, chaotic, nothing, no order, no light, void, however you want to imagine it. And then creation began in what they called the septepi, which was the first moment or the first occasion. In modern scientific terms, we might call it the Big Bang. But for them, they imagined it as a deity emerging from the infinite waters. And again, depending which town or tradition you talk to, they would have given you a different god as being responsible for this moment. The popular one that is most famous is the god Atum, or literally Tem. And his name means totality or completion. He is the god of the sunset, but he is also the god of everythingness, if that's a word. And Atum emerged from the infinite ocean. And again, depending on the tradition, in some cases, some stories, he was standing upon a mound of earth, which we call the primeval mound. And sometimes that was called the Benben, which is the top, it's the pyramid shape at the top of an obelisk, or it is a pyramid itself. And then he created the universe from that first little bit of earth, and everything spread out, like an ink blot, just creation rippling out from him. The mechanism that he used to create everything varies depending on the story. How safe for work is this podcast, generally speaking?
I think as long as it's subtly phrased, I think we'll get away with it.
Okay. So I'll give you the safe for work version first.
Okay.
The safe for work version is that Atum sneezed, and that created the god Shu, who is light, air, the moisture in the air. And he spat, which created Tifnut, who is the goddess of moisture. In another version, he used his male organ to produce those things. He took hold of himself and brought them forth.
Yes.
Ancient Egyptian religion is much more not safe for work than Western Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions would like.
Yeah.
Because the ancient Egyptians weren't squeamish about that. But that's one version. That's one version of the story. Another version would probably be at its root much more familiar to people who have grown up in a monotheistic tradition, which is based around the god Ptah, or as the Egyptians called him, Petech. In this alternate version, Ptah, rather than Atum, emerged at the moment of creation. And instead of physically creating life or gods or existence, he thought of it and he spoke it into being, kind of a gnosis, a Gnostic tradition, or a logos, if you will. Ptah is the closest to like a demiurge in this sort of modern monotheistic conception. He conceived the word, and then he spoke that word, and that thing came into being. And that version ties into the ancient Egyptian understanding of writing and how it crystallizes and makes thought concrete. You can think a million things in your head, but if you write something down, it starts to become tangible. That kind of idea was brought up in the concept of Ptah and how he created the universe. So that's two very different traditions, as you can see, both centered on a single deity who is the point of creation, but the mechanisms are fundamentally different, and these reflect different towns and different priesthoods with their different storytelling.
Yeah.
So I think if you were to compare it to the Greek concept of chaos and then a creator being, they are similar in the broad strokes, because the ancient Egyptians understood that the time before creation was pure chaos. Even if it was nothingness, it was the absence of order. It was the absence of rules, of light, of structure. Therefore, it was inherently chaotic.
Yeah.
I suspect if you spoke to an ancient Greek priest and an Egyptian priest side by side, and you were discussing these, they would find common ground, even if they were using different words or ideas to structure the mythology.
Yeah. It is interesting how many casual parallels such as this there are, even though the broader religion is probably quite separate. So even the idea of Atum creating one way or another, Tefnut and Shu, sort of air and moisture, reminded us quite a lot of Gaia creating Uranos and Pontus, again, air and water.
Mm.
You also get, I believe, people coming from tears, which Hathor cries. I believe that's right. When
It
she,
varies.
yeah, that's probably the caveat with all of this. It varies.
Mm.
But coming back to Atum having been his right eye and then being replaced, but the
Mm.
people coming from tears reminded us a bit of people coming from rocks in the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha after a great flood, which
Mhm.
I suppose a bit like, I believe, Sekhmet trying to wipe out humanity or damage them at least is a result of a deity deciding that humanity needs to be punished, which seems to be surprisingly common throughout a lot of religions.
Yeah, there's a lot we can unpack there. The first
Yeah.
thing I would note is that a great deal of what we know about ancient Egyptian religion comes from Greek and Roman authors visiting or describing Egypt.
Right.
For example, the most complete description of the Osiris and Isis story comes from Plutarch.
Yes.
Many of our descriptions of later religious festivals and traditions comes from Herodotus or Diodorus Siculus, people like this, Strabo as well. So in that sense, we always have to be aware that those Greek authors were filtering Egyptian beliefs through their worldview for an audience of their country folk and peers.
Right.
And so, for example, Herodotus often doesn't use the Egyptian names for the gods. He will call them by their Greek equivalent. So
Ah,
Seth or Sutek is known as Typhon, for example. Ra is Helios, things like that. So we always have to put that asterisk on it that many of the commonalities might be largely influenced by who was writing these down. That being said, compared to 200 years ago, we know a lot more about ancient Egyptian religion from their own point of view and their own language than we did when scholars first began studying Egyptian history as its own distinct subject. There certainly are many parallels, and I think, broadly speaking, depending on your point of view, if you take an anthropological point of view, which I often do because I'm more of a historian than a mythologian, I think they come from natural human anxieties or wonders about the natural world. But they do have important distinctions. For example, in the Near Eastern tradition, like Mesopotamia and Anatolia, which was obviously very impactful on Asia Minor and the Levantine religions, which ultimately developed into the Judeo-Christian tradition. For them, the flood was a negative. It was catastrophic. The flooding of the Euphrates and Tigris destroyed cities or farmsteads or communities semi-regularly. So in the Near Eastern traditions, whence we ultimately get the idea of like Noah, the flood is a negative. For the Egyptians, the flood was the complete opposite. It was a positive. The story you just mentioned of Sekhmet, to give the long and short of that tale appears relatively late, actually, but it tells of how once upon a time, in a long, long ago, the sun god Ra himself actually lived on Earth and ruled humanity as the pharaoh.
yes.
But Ra ruled for a long time and he started to get old and tired. And in the nature of an old and tired king, people began to wonder, is he strong enough to rule anymore? Or should we, can we make a break and call the shots ourselves? So as the tale is told to us from hieroglyph texts, humanity began to plot rebellion, as they phrase it, which for the Egyptian pharaohs, that's the ultimate crime, is to rebel,
Yeah.
to disobey their authority. And so Ra sent down the goddess Hathor as his representative to wreak bloody vengeance upon humanity. And she did a pretty good job of it. She was very effective. But then Ra tried to get her to come home. But Hathor was enjoying herself too much.
Yeah.
And then, as the story phrases it, at that moment, Sekhmet came into being. This is what the story says. It says, Hathor was in her element, and thus Sekhmet came into being. So Sekhmet literally comes from the bloodlust of Hathor.
Right.
And eventually they sort of become worshipped almost as like sister deities, but ultimately they're the same being, just two sides of it, kind of like Janus, I guess, in the Roman tradition.
Yeah.
Sekhmet continued to slaughter humanity, and she was an uncontrollable lioness. Nobody could stop her. And so ultimately, Ra had to consult with his fellow deities, notably Jehoti or Thoth, to figure out how do we stop her. And the gods came up with the plan, let's make a flood of beer, but we'll dye it red so that it looks like blood. And Sekhmet, she likes to drink blood. She's basically a lioness vampire.
Yeah.
So Sekhmet gorges herself on the flood of beer, which is dyed red like blood. She gets very drunk. She falls asleep. And then, like a Pokemon taken back to their Pokeball, she goes back to heaven. But the key thing there, from the comparing, sort of Near Eastern and Judeo-Christian traditions, is that the flood is a savior. It's the way they pacified Sekhmet. Because in ancient Egypt, the flood was the annual source of fertility and life. So it was an absolute positive. It could be a negative occasionally if it was too high and it did damage. But broadly speaking, the flood is a positive tradition in ancient Egyptian. And so the reason I sort of go into that kind of detail is that even if a similar motif appears, the context in which it is appearing and the meaning behind it can be very different. And we always have to be cautious of that because, out there in the public sphere, many people just look, oh, flood, 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 flood. They all must have the same tradition. Actually, it varies a lot by culture.
Yeah. No, I found that with instances of how strongly the Nile and, as you say, the Nile flood influences the mythology. But even if they're only incidental parallels, such as Ra descending to the underworld at the end of the day to face a trial in each of 12 sections of the underworld, a bit like the 12 tasks of Heracles, or the cyclical nature of godly generations, or even the funny incidental parallel, which I found of a group of gods called the Ennead. I believe that's the correct way of saying it, which sounds a bit like Aeneid. It's funny how many casual parallels there are, at least, while obviously acknowledging that these were different religions with a biased observer writing them down for the most part.
Yeah. Well, the Ennead derives from a Greek word, I believe, for nine. The Egyptians called them the Pesjet. So it's that particular connection is much more on the Greek and Roman side. Aeneas the Aeneid of Aeneas, the Ennead, which is the nine gods, who are another one of these pre-creation groups. But definitely there are sort of little superficial parallels like that. Absolutely.
Exactly. And as a crash course in Egyptian mythology, that's certainly interesting. So
it could be much deeper.
Yes. So moving or transitioning away from that and towards Egyptian history, as you've pointed out already, certainly by comparison with Western traditions, Egyptian history is old, even to the ancient world itself. So I believe, isn't the start of Egypt commonly at least accepted to be the unification under Narmer in about 3100 or 3000 BCE?
Yeah, approximately.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, that's a perfectly valid starting point. And I guess today an Egyptologist would always put the asterisks of, the unification itself is something that the Egyptians remembered and they celebrated, but even they didn't necessarily know who was responsible for it. And by the time, say, of Ramesses II, for example, around 1300 BCE, they had actually forgotten the name Narmer.
Wow.
They don't even mention him. They remembered the first king as a chap called Meni, which grammatically, the name Meni, M-N-I, simply means the one who is established,
right,
or the founder, like a founding father. over the long duration of their history, even they ultimately forgot who exactly was responsible.
Yes.
That's assuming that we haven't simply lost all evidence of an actual King Many.
Yeah.
That's well, I could go round and round on that.
Yeah.
But yes, generally speaking, 3000 BCE, give or take, Namer, or one of those rulers, is at current knowledge likely to be one of the unifiers of the Nile Valley.
Yeah. And after Narmer's or whoever's unification, I believe in a grand sweep, let's say, we get four periods of power or unification in the old, middle, and new kingdoms, and then the late period. But what I
Yes.
wanted to sort of mention as something that blew my mind when it first came up, I don't know if it had the same effect on you, is that woolly mammoths were still around on the earth when pyramids were constructed in the old kingdom, which truly made me realize, wow, Egyptian civilization is old.
Yes, I think it's Siberia or something
Yeah,
like that. There were still, they weren't necessarily the great mammoths of
yeah,
the
yeah,
earlier periods, but definitely mammoths still existed and were being hunted by humans around 2600 BCE, which is the approximate date of the construction work at Giza.
yeah,
So yeah, it is a weird. You think of those two things as being completely different eras of history, but they do dovetail.
yeah. So the 2 points that I wanted to focus on in the
Mhm.
new kingdom, let's say, before we get to what's going on in the world around about the time of our story, is first off a recent paper in Nature, which I wondered if you had any comments on, which is that I believe this paper says it was possible that the destruction of the statuary, or at least some statuary, of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, who reminds me a lot of figures like Empress Irene or Wu Zetian in taking power in her own right, may have been ritually destroyed to mark her retirement rather than only as vandalism as revenge by her, I think, stepson slash nephew Tutmos III.
Hmm.
And
Um,
yeah,
I haven't read the scientific paper yet.
yeah,
It's on my reading list of to get
yeah,
around to it. But definitely recently there was at least one publication, a new book by a scholar looking at the life cycle of statues and why they're conceived, how they're used, and then ultimately how they are deactivated. So it's an interesting little, I guess, niche aspect of Egyptian historical research that is currently developing. The best I can say about the Hatshepsut comment or the Hatshepsut argument is that at best it is one small piece of the story of her
yeah,
posthumous legacy rather than a wholesale explanation for what happened to her.
yeah,
And I'll try to give the briefest version of this as I can, but Hatshepsut constructed or commissioned many elaborate monuments throughout Egypt, the most famous of which is her memorial temple at Deir el-Bahri in the modern city of Luxor. That's the one that's like three terraces with the nice columns and the ramp running down. A million Instagrammers go there every day to take the same photo and video of them walking up the ramp, and it all looks very nice. It's a fabulous temple. It is beautiful. It is really elaborate, and the historical information that Hatshepsut recorded on the walls is in some cases second to none. When she died in year 22 of Tutmos III's reign, because technically she only ever dated her reign within the structure of his reign as the full king. When she died after about 15 years of rule in year 22 of Tutmos III, Tutmos himself did not immediately start erasing her and destroying her.
right,
The same officials who served Hatshepsut as, overseer of the treasury, overseer of the granaries, top general, the vizier, prime minister, overseer of Nubia, they all carried on. As far as we can tell, The only reason they disappeared is because they died and they were replaced. And that carried on for about 20 years of Thutmose's sole rule as a mature adult. But at some point, probably in the later years of his reign, Thutmose ultimately ruled for 54 years, and the first 22 of those were he wasn't really in charge. But in the last few years of his reign, he definitely sent agents out to the temples of Hatshepsut or to whatever she had worked on to, as thoroughly as possible, remove her name and put either his name or his father's name in place. Fortunately, the royal agents were not as thorough as they should have been, and there were many cases where they either didn't erase her name or they only erased it slightly and we could still read it, which is how we know she existed.
Yeah.
He definitely did that. Now, the motivations have been viewed in different perspectives over the years. Some historians, especially in the early years, the 1900s, assumed that it was a family vendetta or that he hated her for taking over, or that because she was a woman, she had to be erased.
Yeah.
More recently, historians have gone back and looked at the evidence and said, okay, what do we actually know is happening? We know that he's erasing her. What do we actually know about why? Not a lot. All we know is that he does it. But pharaohs erase predecessors all the time, and they put their own names in their place. Sometimes there are very clear political reasons why they might do it. Sometimes it might even simply be they wanted to have their own name on a religious monument to connect themselves with the deity in question or so forth.
Yeah.
So I'd say in the last 20 years, there's been a lot more kind of, let's go back to the evidence and see what we actually know. And that's raised a lot more questions than answers in terms of what is happening there. The explanation that I kind of like is that because Hatshepsut was Thutmose III's aunt, so he was the son of his father by like a minor wife, secondary wife.
Yeah.
The explanation I kind of like, but ask me in 2 years and my opinion might be different, is that Thutmose erased Hatshepsut because he was trying to secure the legitimacy of his son, Amenhotep II, against a rival branch of the family, the royal family, who would have also had a claim to power.
Right.
Or he was trying to connect himself more strongly with his own father and grandfather, which is Thutmose II and Thutmose I, for a similar purpose, to strengthen his hold on power and thus the power he's going to bequeath to his son.
Yeah.
As for the statues, in many cases, they didn't need to deactivate them. They simply took the names off them and put on Thutmoses. They just turned them into statues of Thutmose. You can do that. It's messy, but you can do it.
Yeah.
Sometimes they very clearly smashed them, but it's not always clear why is a statue smashed or when it was smashed. Just because a statue is lying in a temple broken up doesn't mean that was done by Thutmose. It could have happened in any of the 3,000 years afterwards.
Yeah.
For some reason, this kind of iconoclasm does happen in Egyptian history where people will go out and destroy a statue because they think it's haunted or dangerous or, it's bringing the attention of the wrong god, all that kind of thing. So the ritual deactivation, I think, would only explain a small portion of what is happening to her legacy. Because clearly, whatever Thutmose III's motive, it was successful because subsequently, when pharaohs like Seti I, Ramesses II, and so forth, on their temples, they sometimes carved lists of earlier rulers. Long lists of kings going right back to Mene, the founder, who they imagined was the founder. They always left Hatshepsut out of it. The list will go from Thutmose III's father to Thutmose III, and Hatshepsut is she's not there.
Right.
And there were a couple of other kings they did that to as well. Tutankhamun is a good example. He was always left off the king lists for complicated reasons that I won't talk about right now.
Yeah.
The point is, Hatshepsut was certainly deleted from history. The motivations for that, we do have to admit, remain a point of debate among historians. But it's not as clear-cut as hatred or misogyny. There might be multiple reasons why this was happening.
Right. Well, certainly more ambiguous than the Roman idea of damnatio memoriae.
Yes, and unfortunately, not as unfortunately many early historians of ancient Egypt, they were classicists before they were Egyptologists. You know, they trained in Greek and Roman before they ever started to learn Egyptian hieroglyphs or to study ancient Egyptian history. And many of them did look at Egyptian history through that filter. And they would often use terms like damnatio memoriae to describe Hatshepsut or Akhenaten, who was another figure this happened to. And again, that's something that modern Egyptologists are trying to shake off, that sort of cultural baggage, and say, actually, let's go back and study the evidence, a kind of fresh look at it again. What is actually happening without using these terms, because they kind of color our perception. Yeah, it's messy, essentially.
Yeah. So the sort of ambiguity that we've been talking about with this leads me quite well to my final point before we talk about contemporaneous Egypt, which is the uncertainty that sometimes exists around figures like Tutankhamun, who we just mentioned. So I believe, and you probably have more knowledge or experience of this, that there have been things like genetic studies of the New Kingdom, which have proved rather controversial in how they're accepted by the scholarly community.
Yeah, so I think what you're referencing is the family DNA study that was done in the early 2000s and published in 2010.
Yes.
Which, to give a very brief summary, the idea was to take the royal mummies of the late 18th dynasty, commonly known as the Amarna period, to compare them with Tutankhamun and see what family relationships could be determined based on mitochondrial DNA. And the conclusions that came forth from that were, broadly speaking, we know Tutankhamun is Tutankhamun because he was found in his tomb, sealed, most largely intact, with names.
Yeah.
Great. But there are a bunch of other bodies excavated from the Valley of the Kings from that period where their identity is either a total question mark or at the very least very uncertain. And the results of this study, as it was published, suggested that Tutankhamun was related to this mummy and also this mummy, who were siblings. And those two mummies were related to another pair whose identity we know for certain. And therefore, these two mummies were Akhenaten and Nefertiti. There were three, to give it a very basic summary, there were three major issues with this study. The first was the very question of, can the DNA survive from a 3,300-year-old mummy in good enough condition that you can identify those relationships with certainty? Now, 99% of Egyptologists, and I include myself here, are not forensic pathologists or DNA experts.
Yeah.
And when this study was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, multiple people who are DNA specialists responded to it saying, this evidence that you've put forward doesn't square with what we know about the degradation of DNA and the information that can be extracted from that. To add to that is the uncertainty about how mummies themselves were prepared, because one possible method that may have been used to dry out the body was kind of a saline solution, almost like an incredibly salty liquid. The problem is, if they do that, that's going to destroy the DNA quite thoroughly because it's seeping into every element of the body, degrading that organic matter, which is the whole point of mummification. And the third major problem and this was more of a historical one, is that we don't know who Tutankhamun's parents were.
Right.
We know that he was the son of a king because there is a block from a temple that it's broken, but it seems to show Tutankhamun with part of the title King's Son of His Body. The problem there is that we don't know which king it's referring to. And the history of that period just before Tutankhamun has enough question marks in terms of like who is king at any one moment. Are there co-regents? Are there multiple rulers? To seriously complicate the question of who is Tutankhamun's father and who is his mother. We're pretty sure his mother was not Nefertiti, because at no point is he ever referred to as son of the queen, and she is never called mother of the king. Nefertiti is a whole other topic. Her entire life story has changed dramatically in the past 10 years. So basically, to give it a real simple gloss, the people doing the study in Cairo put forward a very specific interpretation of the evidence they had acquired. Multiple outside commentators who are specialists in this kind of science came forth with critiques saying this doesn't add up with what we know of the science of DNA and how it survives. And then there were also multiple gaps in the historical knowledge where we could say, your reconstruction is one possible interpretation of the evidence, but you are presenting it as if it is the definitive interpretation. And that's a no-no in history. Happens all the time, but it's a no-no.
Yeah.
The best I think you can say about that particular DNA study is that nobody would use it as definitive evidence to reconstruct the history of the period. At least no Egyptologist or academic historian would. We'll talk about it because it's still useful work, but the very best you can say is that the conclusions came with hefty asterisks or question marks. And generally speaking, none of the historians that I read have used it as a key part of their reconstructions since.
Yeah. Obviously, here on the show, we wouldn't be qualified to definitively rule on the lineage of all of this either, but I will endeavor to leave some further reading in the show notes for those who are interested. Hopping forward a little bit, we come to the period that we are in, which, roughly speaking, although the Trojan War is firmly based in mythology, there are reports dating it within the chronology that people believed in at the time to, let's say, around the 1180s BCE. Now, my understanding is we've skipped past Ramses II and his dozens and dozens of children and decades-long reign, and have gotten to a period which has got a fair amount of drama, let's say, happening all at once in Egyptian history. Relatively, things like the Bronze Age collapse, royal conspiracies, and I believe also the Sea Peoples. So what I essentially wanted to ask you is, if we zoom out to a macroscopic level, roughly what is going on in Egypt around about this time that the Romans and Greeks believed that Troy was falling?
Okay. You're right that it's a very fun or dramatic period of history. I haven't reached it on my podcast yet, but I'm very much looking forward to telling these stories.
Yeah.
If we just take for a moment that 1180 BCE is when this is all going down.
Yep.
Roughly speaking, the king at this point is a chap named Ramesses III. He is no relation, as far as we know, to Ramesses II. He might be, a son of a minor branch of one of Ramesses' many sons,
Right, yeah.
By the time Ramesses II died, the royal household had literally dozens of people who could claim a direct blood descent from that pharaoh.
Yeah.
God knows how they were sorting this out internally. Ramesses III came to power when his father, a man named Setnakht, died. And Setnakht only ruled for a short period, less than a decade, I think, off the top of my head. But Setnakht himself seems to have seized power in a civil war. That's the most likely reconstruction we have at the moment. After overthrowing the last of the descendants of Ramesses II, a queen named Tauseret, who had taken power as a pharaoh in her own right, Setnakht seems to have rebelled, overthrown her, maybe killed her, turfed her out of her tomb, taken over that tomb for himself. It's a whole dramatic thing. It's quite fun. Point is, Ramesses III inherits power at this point. His family lineage or his connection to royal legitimacy is hanging by a thread. So he does the very best thing you can do in Egyptian royal traditions. He takes on the names and legacy of Ramesses II.
Yeah.
He calls himself by a throne name that is basically identical to that of his predecessor, with a couple of minor variations, just so you could tell them apart. He builds temples that are very similar to those of Ramesses II. In some places within his temples, he takes artistic scenes that Ramesses II had put on his temples and literally copies them onto the walls of his, really hammering home this idea that he is the next incarnation of that glorious reign. He is the true successor of the great Ramesses. And whether this next part is motivated by that or simply, a useful thing, he goes on a tear of military activity. Within the first decade of his reign, Ramesses faces off against two major military forces, or he describes them as military forces, one of which is the Libyans coming from the west, who seem to be migrating along the North African coast, most likely due to climatic changes happening in the Mediterranean, what we call the 3.2 Ka event.
Yeah.
And then we have the Sea Peoples. And the Sea Peoples were actually known in Egyptian history as early as the days of Ramesses II. Ramesses II had Sea Peoples in his bodyguard. They were called the Sherden. He fought against them early in his reign, defeated them, and recruited them as his bodyguard, and they show up in his art with their distinctive helmets and armor as his little Mediterranean, Near Eastern warriors. But Ramesses III fights against them directly after, as he describes it, the Sea Peoples had overthrown other great kingdoms and empires like Hatti or the Hittites.
Right.
Without getting too deep into the woods, Ramesses defeats these peoples and settles them. He takes them prisoner and he sends them to farms and communities within Egypt, including Libyans, including the Sea Peoples. He basically, puts them to work on farming estates. And they settle. They become part of the community and population, and that has long-term ramifications for the populations of the region and the political history of Egypt. But that's a whole nother story. As Ramesses III tells it, and we always have to take these accounts with a grain of salt because they're not true historical accounts. They are works of advertising, religious propaganda. They're selling a certain message, which is the pharaoh is always victorious. He always defeats chaos. He always maintains order, all that jazz. But if we take the basic tenets as being broadly accurate and correct, then Ramesses and the Egyptians fortunately managed to weather the storm that seems to overwhelm many of the Near Eastern communities, especially the northern ones in Hatti. They managed to repel the invasions and assimilate them into their own culture. They were able to maintain agricultural continuity thanks to the Nile and thanks to the flood, which we talked about earlier. It's not all happy days. There are issues going on within the Egyptian state, from administrative documents or written records. We hear about corruption disputes in the Egyptian state, like officials doing whatever they want without paying attention to justice and the law, and they have to be dealt with, sometimes severely. There is a famous situation in which the royal household, especially in the south, seems to be having trouble paying its employees because the workers of Deir al-Medina, who are the artisans who build the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, we have a record of them that at a certain point they hadn't been paid for about 2 months. And these artisans were state employees. They were regularly paid by the state. This was their job, and the king paid for it.
Yeah.
They hadn't been paid for about 2 months, so they literally went on strike. They put down their tools and they marched down to the temple of Ramesses III, which is a hop, skip, and a jump down the road. And they literally had a sit-in. They went into the temple, sat down, and refused to move until the local high official came and negotiated and guaranteed them payment. And they didn't go back to work until they received that payment. So, that's one incident, but it is evidence that things are not going great in the wider economy and the wider state. But still, compared to the other states like Hatti, Egypt survives it pretty well overall, which I think is as much a testament to the Nile and its predictability and regularity as anything else. The Hittites didn't have a great river they could rely on. They were much more hill and rainfall-based agriculture. very susceptible to climate change. That.
Yeah.
So their empire kind of got washed away or burnt away a bit, I guess.
Yeah.
Similar things, obviously, with the Near East, which I'm sure you've covered in more detail on your podcast. But the Egyptians are paying attention to all of this, and they are interacting with them. So after Ramesses II dies, his son and successor, Meneptah, he actually has an interesting record of the Hittites coming to him saying, we're in trouble. We need grain because the rain hasn't come. And Meneptah actually sends them in a care package, like an aid funding. He sends barges of grain to Hatti to keep them alive. And these kind of things happen throughout Egyptian history. A famous example from later is around 600 BCE, the pharaoh Ahmose II, he hears about an earthquake at Delphi and the destruction of the oracle there. He sends wealth to pay for reconstruction at Delphi. The Egyptians were, by the 1300 BCE period and later, they were becoming increasingly connected with the Aegean world and the Asia Minor scene, and they were interacting with them constantly.
Yeah.
I could go on, but I don't want to bore your listeners. There's a lot of really cool connections going on there.
Yeah. It sounds, in terms of the troubles going on in Egypt / elsewhere in the world, slightly analogous to something that happens far later in Roman history, the crisis of the 3rd century. You get this combination of environmental factors, I assume, the end of the Roman warm period in about 250, the army getting restless, economic troubles, invasions from outside forces, all leading to what I believe would technically be known to the populace by a scientific term as a very bad time. It sounds somewhat analogous, and isn't there another similarity in the sense that round about this time, isn't there some sort of conspiracy by one royal against Ramesses III? I seem to remember reading something called the Harem conspiracy, but I might be only have the surface level detail on that.
Yeah, so that's a fun story that's actually changed quite recently in really cool ways. So we have a papyrus which comes from the reign of Ramesses III, or that general period. It describes a court case against members of the royal house. Egyptologists try not to use the term harem anymore because it's a leftover from the Ottoman Empire, but it doesn't really apply to the ancient Egyptian terminology, but that's by the by.
Fair enough.
We just kind of just call them the apartments now, or the palace, the domestic quarters of the king, queen, wives, children. Anyway, within that environment, one of the queens, not the main queen, but a secondary wife, hatches a plot to have the pharaoh murdered and her son placed on the throne as his successor.
Wow.
This wasn't the first time such a conspiracy had happened. We got examples from the Middle and the Old Kingdom as well of similar plots. Chances are it happened relatively often. I'm imagining these kind of conspiracies were quashed quietly most of the time, but sometimes they might go way too far and they have to be dealt with in a semi-public fashion, such as a court case, and these are recorded. We hear about witnesses, we hear about testimonies, we hear about a tribunal adjudicating, and we hear about the punishment, which was death for the conspirators.
Yeah.
For many years, the big question was, did the conspiracy work? Did it actually manage to make an attempt on the life of the king? Or were they caught in time and punished?
Yeah.
We now know that they did make an attempt and they actually succeeded, because in the past 10 to 15 years, when scientists in Cairo did a new set of CT scans on the mummy of Ramesses III, they found that a scarf he is wearing around his neck actually conceals a gash.
Wow.
His throat was cut. And his throat was not just cut, it was severed right down to the spine. They nearly cut his head off.
Ow.
I'm pretty sure he didn't survive that.
Yeah, you think.
But that is a discovery that, because we don't want to poke around the mummy too much, could only be really achieved with X-ray or CT scanning, confirming that, yes, Ramesses III died by assassination.
Wow.
And this was subsequently punished in a court case in the royal household. and the conspirators were executed. And yeah, it's quite a dramatic little sequence of events. Obviously, that would have been kind of a real psychological shock to the system, I
Yeah.
think. It completely upends the traditional structure of father-son inheritance in the Egyptian monarchy. Ironically, it kind of parallels the tales of Osiris and Horus.
Yeah.
So it might not have been that devastating in that sense. They might have looked at it and said, "Oh, it's just like it was back in the days of the gods. You know, this terrible thing has happened, but look, the king is dead. Long live the king. You know, like he's back. It's fine."
Yeah.
But politically, that's quite a thing. It's to have this strong, well-established, legitimate monarch violently cut down. Such disorder within the royal household speaks of a real religious and philosophical rot happening, which is not supposed to happen.
Yeah. Wow, my goodness, really sounding more crisis of the third century than I ever expected this period roundabout now.
Yeah, I guess the best you could say about it is that the crises of major political monarchies often parallel one another because
Yeah.
they're fundamentally built on similar structures, you know, military, religious, and economic control and domination, all of which are extremely susceptible to environmental and climate factors. I don't think historically we give nearly enough credit to how much a few bad harvests can really affect the stability of a state.
Yeah.
Especially once historians started to become more professionalized, they became more divorced from the fundamental working realities of their societies, and it became easier to neglect those kind of questions.
Yeah.
But yeah, a cycle of bad climates and, you know, stuttering harvests or failing harvests can very quickly topple well-established political structures.
Yeah.
And a very good modern example is the fact that the Syrian civil war, a major factor that influenced it was a period of drought happening within that region in the early 2010s. People became desperate, fed up with the government, led to an outbreak of conflict. Now we have a whole new regime in Syria. These kind of things happen in cycles.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, a very interesting time period, though probably not as fun of a one to be alive in as some earlier and or later periods.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
nobody wants to be alive during the collapse, but you got to make the best of it,
Yeah.
as Gandalf says.
Yeah. So the final point in this general period that I wanted to touch on briefly was that the fun continues, I believe it's fair to say, for the house that Ramesses III belongs to. In
Mm-hmm.
this, isn't there one of the first recorded instances or the instances that we see of smallpox in the royal family round about this time?
Yes. Off the top of my head, I think it's Sipatar who comes just before Ramesses III. Um, his mummy, which you can see in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, has very clear sort of pustules or almost like buboes on his skin,
Yeah.
all over his head and face. I'm pretty sure it's Sipatar, but I could be getting my wires crossed that this is one of the earliest likely examples of a smallpox epidemic that is visible in the physical forensic record.
Yeah.
Ancient Egypt, as an agricultural society, you know, humans living in close quarters with animals, they had their epidemics fairly regularly. And Sekhmet, incidentally, was the one responsible for these kind of plagues and devastation.
Yeah.
They certainly had a lot of them. Tutankhamun, for example, was recently confirmed that early in his childhood, he had a very severe bout of malaria, and that probably left him quite physically, not necessarily frail, but sort of slightly weakened compared to a child who hasn't experienced malaria, I guess is the way
Yeah.
you can say it. These kind of things, which are almost only made possible really with medical technological analysis that doesn't involve destroying a mummy. We're learning about them every few years on figures, and it's a really interesting field of Egyptology.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I've seen a similar instance of smallpox, I believe, crop up in Ramesses V. So the general impression I'm getting is not a lot of fun to be an Egyptian royal either at this time.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think by and large, you and I, we have a life that is more comfortable and well provisioned than even a pharaoh of like Ramesses II's time.
Yeah,
They had their needs taken care of and this entire society ordered around them, but medical knowledge was still very limited. They didn't understand the causes of cancers or internal diseases. They were excellent at treating wounds, any breakages, very sophisticated medical knowledge on that, but anything internal was kind of a mystery to them. Obviously, food hygiene, much better today
yeah.
compared to them. Ramesses II, for example, his teeth terribly worn and abscess ridden because of a diet that was probably quite high in sort of sandy grit from the bread that is being baked outside and getting little bits of it in the dough. Probably too many sweets as well, too much honey, too much natural sugar and fruits and things that he's consuming. Studies of Ramesses II recently with CT scans have shown that by the end of his life in his late 80s, he was probably hobbling around like bent double, terrible arthritis.
Wow.
Not a happy life by the
Yeah.
end. Yep.
So, as a kind of coda to our discussion today, I wanted to look forwards, let's say, from our perspective, less the Trojan War time period and more Alba Longa, early Rome, and downwards, but what for ancient Egypt would have been the winding down of the period of independence, let's say. So I think it's fair to say that after the collapse of the New Kingdom, we get gradually an increased involvement by Near Eastern powers, such as, I believe, the Assyrians or the Achaemenid Persians, and then
Mm-hmm.
ultimately domination by the Greek Macedonian Ptolemies. Would that be a fair summary of what happens after this period?
Yes, with an asterisk.
Yeah,
It
of
sort of
course.
depends on the perspective you're taking. Many of the historical narratives that we still take for granted developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which is not coincidentally the period of nationalism
Yeah,
in Europe. And this perception of individual nation peoples and nation states struggling against one another for domination that still plays a part in the way we perceive the histories of these cultures today. From a political perspective, the Egyptian state was certainly less arrogant, I'll
yeah,
say, in the first millennium BCE, because as is the case with most historical empires, case in point, the Romans, their period of greatest success comes when their enemies are at their least organized, their least adaptable, and their least capable of resisting.
yeah,
But as soon as those rival cultures adapt to the new circumstances and begin using them against the imperial power, oftentimes the central authority struggles to maintain its hegemony against these new approaches. Happened to the Romans, happened to the successor states of Alexander, happened to Napoleon,
yeah.
happened to the Third Reich, all of them. So I give that as a necessary prefix to how we perceive the history of ancient Egypt. We tend to think of the Golden Ages as being these times which are most similar to a nation state, the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms. Egyptians calling the shot for Egyptians. They're in control. It's glorious. They're powerful. They dominate other peoples. How wonderful. Okay, fair enough. From a political standpoint or a nation state standpoint, that is one way of looking at it. But the late period is also the most vibrant that we have in terms of the material culture, the religious life, and the documents of daily life and business out of all Egyptian history. We know way more about the day-to-day business of people in late period Egypt, what they're getting up to, how they're dealing with one another, than we do for the earlier eras. The problem is that the pharaoh is not quite so powerful. The splendors are not quite so glorious. The monuments are not so large and impressive. So I
Yeah,
guess how would you phrase it? The nice aspects of the civilization are far more transient. They're the daily life things. Whereas pyramids, those last for thousands of years, great tourist attractions. But
yeah,
the late period is fantastic from the perspective of daily life. If you're interested in actual society, how people are living, the late period is one of the places to go. You'll get a huge swathe of information. And the same is true for the Greco-Roman era. We have vast quantities of written documents and burial goods and all kinds of things to testify to the vibrancy and the business of their civilization and culture, which is carrying on. And it's just as vibrant as it ever was. It's just that the political structure at the top has changed.
yeah.
But how much did that really affect the ordinary person working on their farm? They only travel like a day in any direction during their life, maybe a bit further by the river. A New Kingdom Egyptian never met the pharaoh. They had no care about Ramesses beyond the propaganda or maybe the vague sense of accomplishment and pride in what the temples represented. But their lifestyle wasn't fundamentally different from a late period Egyptian's. If anything, a late period Egyptian was having a better lifestyle because they had access to the vast trading networks that were now connecting them all the way to India.
Yeah.
And I think it's in the early Greek period, the early Ptolemaic era, we have traders who are living or making their base in Egypt, sailing all the way along the Arabian Peninsula to India. That wasn't happening in the Pharaonic period. So I really wouldn't say that the late period is a decline, except in the grandiose imperial perspective. I would say that in the life of 99% of the population, it was business as usual.
Yeah.
If not, slightly improving in many respects. We do tend to get distracted by the gold and the treasures and the pyramids and the temples, which, don't get me wrong, those are amazing and they're really impressive and the hallmarks of an amazing political and economic establishment. But they're not the whole story. And the more we learn about the minutiae of life and what other people are going on, I think the more that later era really comes alive.
Yeah. And even in these later centuries, we get the persistence of ancient Egyptian ruler symbols, let's say. So skipping past the Ptolemies and there's sometimes violent acts such as dismembering their own sons. We'll skip breezily past that for now. I found it quite surprising, although I've only done a surface level glance at this, to find out that the title of pharaoh and the use of pharaonic names persisted after the Roman absorption of Egypt up to, I think it's Maximinus Dia or Maximinus II, who has the last attested pharaonic title usage, who, by way of an in-law's in-law sort of thing, is connected to Constantine the Great in the 4th century. So it is astonishing how long ancient Egyptian influences continue to last, even when their political independence no longer does.
Yes, it's a thing that the Roman emperors, starting with Augustus, very smartly learned from the Ptolemies, which is that if you wanted to be a legitimate and stable ruler of Egyptian society, you had to play by certain rules, certain forms. You couldn't just present yourself as a Roman emperor. You had to appear as a pharaoh.
Yeah.
And starting with Augustus all the way through for centuries, when the Roman emperors appear in Egyptian temples, they appear in the traditional style of Egyptian pharaohs, the costume, the outfit, with the names, with the titles in hieroglyphs. The hieroglyphs themselves will often simply be transcriptions of the Greek and Roman titles like Autocrat or Basileus or Imperator or Caesaris is how they write Caesar in hieroglyphs.
Yeah.
So it'll be the same word, but put into hieroglyphs. But that doesn't matter because 99% of the population couldn't read the hieroglyphs anyway. But they could recognize that that ruler was fitting the blueprint, so to speak. And that fundamentally put them in the same lineage as your Ramesses, your Montuhoteps, your Names. They were, at least in the temples, at least in the cosmic sense, the inheritors of that system. And the Roman emperors dealt with Egypt very carefully.
Yeah.
For two reasons. Firstly, it was valuable for the grain. They really needed that grain for Rome and then later for Constantinople, major cities that could not feed themselves on their own hinterland. So they had to import the grain, and Egypt was the most reliable exporter of grain of all the territories they controlled. But it was also famously difficult to rule if you didn't play by the rules, and there were rebellions, especially during the early Augustan period. We hear about rebellions against Roman rule and prefects, like a chap named Cornelius Gallus, who have to go put them down. He eventually invaded all the way into Sudan. It's quite a fun story. I'm quite fond of him. But ultimately, the way that Augustus dealt with it was to make Egypt a personal province of the emperor. It was not a senatorial province. It was not governed by consuls or governors. It was governed by his representative. But the entire Nile Valley that they ruled was treated as part of the imperial household of the emperor himself. And that reflects, I think, both the importance of the Nile Valley to their economic and political needs, but also to the difficulty of ruling that particular society, which already had such a long and well-established tradition of rulership and what that rulership meant. The Romans didn't mess with that too much if they could avoid it. Certainly, that changes as the centuries go on. Eventually you get the abolition of the pagan cults, which was a very big deal in Egypt. Even though Christianity had taken root quite strongly by that point within Egypt, the final closure of the polytheistic temples was not something that just happened overnight. It took generations, and there's even evidence that certain areas, they didn't enforce it too strongly because they didn't want to cause trouble. So that long tradition of rulership which the Egyptians had, and the incredible depth and antiquity of their religious traditions carried on during the Roman period, to the point that three fun things happened, which I think are really interesting.
Yeah.
Firstly, the imagery of the mother goddess, Ise or Isis. In ancient Egyptian imagery, that mother goddess, which is sometimes Isis, sometimes other deities, she would often appear in statues or two-dimensional art with her son, Horus, sitting on her lap. That iconography almost certainly shaped the iconography of Mother Mary within the early Christian traditions.
Wow.
Right down to, the halo that often appears with Mary is a direct analog for the solar disk that often appears on these mother deities' heads.
Okay.
It's one-to-one. The second one is the cool sort of syncretism or cultural adaptation you see of Egyptian deities. One of my favorite versions of this is you will get statues or two-dimensional images of the god Horus, who's the lord of kingship. In Egyptian art, traditionally, he'll appear like any pharaoh, wearing a crown, a short kilt, maybe body armor in some cases. In the Roman period, he starts to show up dressed like a legionary or a centurion. Okay. It is the coolest thing. He has the full-on cuirass, breastplate, that distinctive skirt with the sort of leather strips hanging down. He looks like a legionary, but with a falcon's head. It's really cool and really fun.
Yeah.
The third one is how the goddess Ise or Isis, her religion spread right through the Roman Empire. Very popular.
Yeah.
A very famous example of this is that Isis had her own temple in the town of Pompeii, which is very well preserved thanks to the obliteration of Pompeii. And you can go visit the temple of Isis in this little spa town in Italy. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But that kind of cultural continuity or religious continuity really, I think, is best encapsulated in what we know as the last hieroglyph inscription. And whether it actually was the last inscription, who knows, but it's the last surviving. It has a date, which is approximately 394 CE or AD, just 2 or 3 years after Theodosius had closed the temples and pagan cults of the empire in favor of Christianity.
Yeah.
But this last hieroglyph inscription turns up at the Temple of Philae, which is one of the temples sacred to Ise or Isis, very far south of Egypt, so kind of on the limits of Roman imperial authority within this region. So maybe, the local governor isn't too concerned about it. He's not watching too closely what the people down in Philae are doing, or they kind of turned a blind eye because they didn't want any local trouble.
Yeah.
But in the Temple of Philae, of Isis, and also a local god named Mundulus, who's kind of a local adaptation of a fertility god called Min. A priestly family, like a little dynasty of local priests, were maintaining the religion and cult of Philae for Isis and Mundulus. And in 394 CE, a couple of years after Theodosius had supposedly shut down all the temples, this local priest carved an inscription on one of the temple walls. And it's a relatively short inscription. It just describes, this chap who works for the temple or works for the goddess Isis. And he leaves a record with a date, which can be correlated with the imperial records to give us 394 CE. And he simply says, I left this inscription for this deity. Please remember me. The fun thing is that he carved that inscription on a gate that was constructed by the Emperor Hadrian.
Oh, wow.
It's this really evocative little dovetailing of the imperial cult tradition.
Yeah.
In its last gasp at the southern limit of Egypt, just as Christianization is in full swing and now has imperial backing and authority.
Yeah.
But if you take that 394 as the end, the last vestige of pharaonic culture, finally dying, that still gives you at least 3,400 years of recorded history of pharaonic religion and ideals and philosophy, only ending in the later half of the Roman imperial period.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And it kind of just emphasizes the ridiculous longevity of Egypt as a cultural institution.
Yeah. Wow. Incredible. Well, that brings us to the end of both what I'm going to call our crash course in Egyptian history and to the end of our episode. So, Dominic Perry, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been fascinating to talk about where ancient Egypt is at the time that the Autocrat podcast currently is, and looking forward to the point where our two narratives will ultimately converge in I have no idea how many episodes' time.
Yeah, knowing my pace, it's going to be a good 10 years before I even reach the Roman period, but I'll do my best. But thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure, and I hope I haven't talked too much and bored your listeners terribly, but that's podcasting.
Oh yeah, both shows love a tangent. I'm sure we're fine.
Excellent. That's very good. Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, I hope everyone listens to the Autocrat podcast. And if they're interested, come find me at the History of Egypt.
Yes, I'll second that. Please do go and check out the History of Egypt if you haven't already. And until next time, have a great week, everyone.
Thanks very much. Have a good week.